This is a pipe. Specifically, it's a cross-section of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, recovered from the Baltic seabed after the September 2022 explosions that destroyed both Nord Stream pipelines in a single night. The pipe wall is 4.1 centimeters of high-strength steel, designed to withstand 220 bars of internal pressure and a century of corrosive seawater. It was supposed to be indestructible. It took approximately 500 kilograms of explosives to prove otherwise. In that single night, 1,230 kilometers of pipeline infrastructure, representing $21 billion in construction costs, became scrap metal on the ocean floor. 55 billion cubic meters of annual capacity, enough to heat 26 million European homes, vanished from the global energy map. An asset that took 12 years to plan, permit, and build was eliminated in roughly 12 minutes. Here's what should concern everyone who thinks about energy infrastructure. Russia watched what happened to its pipelines. Russia understood the vulnerability that fixed infrastructure creates. And Russia has spent the last 3 years building an energy export system that cannot be destroyed the same way, because it doesn't stay in one place long enough to target. On January 16, 2026, the liquefied natural gas carrier Christophe de Margerie completed its 847th Arctic voyage, delivering 172,000 cubic meters of LNG from the Yamal Peninsula to a receiving terminal in Zhejiang Province, China. The voyage took 19 days. No fixed infrastructure connected origin to destination. No pipeline could be sabotaged. No choke point existed where a single intervention could halt the flow. This is not a backup system. This is the replacement. Russia's answer to the question of how you export hydrocarbons when your enemies have demonstrated willingness to blow up the pipes. Here's what they're not telling you. The distinction between pipeline gas and liquefied natural gas is not merely technical, it's strategic. A pipeline is a fixed asset, a line on a map that begins at point A and ends at point B, vulnerable at every kilometer of its route. It requires right-of-way agreements with every country it crosses. It depends on compressor stations that can be targeted, valve systems that can be shut, and physical integrity that can be compromised by anyone with sufficient motivation and capability. LNG is different. Gas is cooled to minus 162 degrees Celsius, condensed to 1/600th of its gaseous volume, loaded onto specialized tankers, and shipped to wherever buyers will pay. The infrastructure is mobile, tankers that can reroute mid-voyage, that can anchor offshore and wait for better prices, that can serve any terminal equipped to receive them. The supply chain has no fixed path to attack. Russia understood this difference intellectually before September 2022. After September 2022, Russia understood it existentially. The lesson was unmistakable. Fixed infrastructure creates dependencies that adversaries can exploit. Mobile infrastructure creates optionality that fixed systems cannot match. Yamal LNG, Russia's flagship Arctic liquefaction facility, was already operational when the pipelines exploded. Capacity was 16.5 million tons per year, roughly equivalent to 23 billion cubic meters of pipeline gas. The facility was built through a partnership with France's Total Energies and China's CNPC, using Western technology and Asian financing to create an export corridor that bypassed Europe entirely. Arctic LNG 2, the second major facility, achieved first production in December 2025, adding another 19.8 million tons of annual capacity, despite Western sanctions that were supposed to make the project impossible. The liquefaction modules were fabricated in China after European contractors withdrew. The financing came from Chinese and Indian banks after Western capital markets closed. The technology gaps were filled through a combination of Russian domestic development, Chinese engineering, and components sourced from countries that never signed on to sanctions. At 4:45 a.m. Moscow time on January 3, 2026, the first cargo from Arctic LNG 2 departed Utrenier terminal aboard the ice-class tanker Asia Energy, bound for Jiangsu Province, China. The shipment represented proof of concept. Russia can build LNG export infrastructure without Western participation, can operate it profitably at Arctic temperatures, and can deliver product to markets that no Western policy can close. The pipelines are gone. The replacement system is operational, and the replacement system cannot be sabotaged in a single night. This is where the lie becomes unsustainable. Western sanction strategy against Russian LNG rested on the assumption that Arctic liquefaction is technologically dependent on Western components, particularly specialized cryogenic equipment, liquefaction turbines, and LNG carrier vessels manufactured in South Korean and Japanese shipyards. The assumption was partially correct and entirely inadequate. The specialized equipment is difficult to replace. Baker Hughes turbines, Linde cryogenic systems, and Chart Industries heat exchangers represent decades of engineering refinement that Russian or Chinese alternatives cannot fully match. Arctic LNG-2 has experienced efficiency losses of 8 to 12% compared to design specifications, attributed to substitute components that don't perform at Western quality levels. But 8 to 12% efficiency losses still mean 88 to 92% efficiency. A facility designed for 19.8 million tons per year that achieves 17.5 million tons per year is still the third largest LNG export facility on Earth. Sanctions made the project more expensive and less optimal. They did not make it impossible. The ice-class LNG carriers are a particular vulnerability that has been systematically addressed. When sanctions prohibited South Korean shipyards from delivering vessels ordered by Russian entities, Russia faced a genuine bottleneck. Arc-7 ice-class carriers are among the most complex ships ever built, and no Russian shipyard had constructed one. The response was a combination of fleet acquisition and domestic development. Older tankers were purchased on secondary markets, reflagged through shell companies, and deployed on Arctic routes during the extended navigation season when ice-class ratings aren't required. New vessels were ordered from Chinese shipyards that are not subject to Korean and Japanese sanctions, with delivery schedules beginning in 2027. At 9:30 a.m. Singapore time on January 10, 2026, shipping intelligence firm Vessels Value identified 14 LNG carriers conducting Russia-origin voyages that were registered to ownership structures obscured through multiple layers of offshore entities. The shadow fleet concept that enabled Russian crude oil exports has expanded to LNG, vessels that operate outside Western insurance, registration, and tracking systems while conducting commerce that sanctions were designed to prevent. The infrastructure exists, the fleet exists, the customers exist, the system operates. When institutions do this, they're not managing risk, they're containing disaster. The strategic implications of Russia's LNG pivot extend far beyond energy markets. On January 12, 2026, U.S. Deputy Secretary of Energy David Turk testified before the Senate Energy Committee on emerging challenges to global energy security. His prepared remarks mentioned Russian LNG twice, both times to note that sanctions were constraining growth. His response to questioning was more candid. The Russian Arctic LNG complex represents a structural shift in global gas supply that will influence markets for decades, regardless of sanctions outcomes. The structural shift is twofold. First, Russia has demonstrated that major energy export infrastructure can be built outside Western capital markets, using non-Western technology and serving non-Western customers. The template is now available for any nation that anticipates future Western sanctions pressure. Iran is reportedly studying Russian LNG development models. Venezuela has requested Chinese technical assistance for offshore gas projects. The sanctions-proofing playbook has been written and is being distributed. Second, Russia has created export optionality that pipeline dependency never provided. When Nord Stream fed Germany, Russian gas went to Germany or nowhere. When Yamal LNG loads tankers, Russian gas goes to China, India, Japan, South Korea, Spain, France, or any other destination where the price is right and the politics allow. The same molecule can serve different markets on different voyages based on real-time commercial calculations. This optionality inverts the leverage equation. Pipeline suppliers are dependent on pipeline customers because there's nowhere else for the gas to go. LNG suppliers are independent of individual customers because the cargo can always go somewhere else. Russia's LNG fleet has transformed it from a supplier constrained by fixed infrastructure into a supplier empowered by mobile infrastructure. Less than 24 months remain before Russian Arctic LNG capacity reaches 50 million tons annually, approximately 70 billion cubic meters of gas equivalent, exceeding the combined volume of both Nord Stream pipelines at peak operation. The infrastructure destroyed in September 2022 will have been fully replaced, in a form that cannot be destroyed the same way. The window for Western sanctions to prevent this outcome has closed. The infrastructure is built. The question now is what it means. While one side sanctions, the other side ships. Russia's Arctic LNG strategy integrates three components that collectively create a resilient export system: production facilities, shipping capacity, and route infrastructure. The production facilities are concentrated on the Yamal and Gidan peninsulas, remote Arctic locations accessible only by sea and air. The remoteness that makes construction difficult also makes interference difficult. No foreign military can project power to the Yamal Peninsula without crossing Russian airspace and territorial waters. The facilities are as protected by geography as any military installation. The shipping capacity operates on ice-class vessels that can navigate the Northern Sea route year-round with Russian icebreaker escort. The escort requirement creates control. Russia determines which vessels transit, on what schedule, at what price. It also creates security. Vessels under Rosatom icebreaker escort operate within a de facto Russian naval protection zone. The route infrastructure has been developed to support continuous Arctic navigation, regardless of ice conditions. Nuclear icebreakers, 7 in operation with 3 more under construction, maintain shipping channels through the winter ice pack. Search and rescue stations have been established at 200-kilometer intervals along the Northern Sea route. Navigation systems provide real-time ice condition monitoring that allows route optimization around the worst conditions. On January 8, 2026, the icebreaker 50 Let Pobedi completed a winter escort of 3 LNG carriers through the eastern sector of the Northern Sea route, a passage that was considered commercially impossible 5 years ago due to ice conditions. The passage took 11 days. All 3 vessels reached their Asian destinations without incident. The envelope of navigable conditions has expanded steadily as climate change thins the ice and Russian infrastructure improves. China's role in the LNG corridor extends beyond purchasing. CNOOC operates LNG receiving terminals optimized for Russian Arctic cargoes, with cold chain logistics that maximize efficiency for the specific properties of Yamal origin gas. Chinese shipyards are building the next generation of ice-class carriers that will expand fleet capacity beyond current levels. Chinese banks provide trade finance that keeps the system liquid regardless of Western financial sanctions. The integration is comprehensive. Russia produces, Russia ships, China receives, China finances. The entire supply chain operates within a bilateral corridor that Western policy cannot interdict without measures that neither side is prepared to take. The mathematics of the trap are now inescapable. Western policymakers face a configuration where every response carries costs exceeding benefits. Response option 1. Expand sanctions to cover all Russian LNG. Current sanctions target specific projects and specific vessels. They do not prohibit all purchases of Russian LNG. Expanding to a full embargo would remove 40 million tons from global supply, approximately 8% of global LNG trade, creating price spikes that would harm Western consumers and industries more than Russian exporters. Asian buyers would absorb the cargoes that Europeans refused, at discounts that compensate for sanctions risk. Response option 2. Target the shadow fleet with interdiction. Physically stopping vessels carrying Russian LNG would require naval operations in international waters, creating legal complications and escalation risks that no Western government has accepted for oil tankers, let alone LNG carriers. LNG tankers are also significantly more dangerous to intercept. The cargo is cryogenic and explosive, and any accident would create environmental and humanitarian consequences. Response option 3. Outcompete Russian LNG with Western supply. U.S. LNG exports have grown to 88 million tons annually, and additional projects are under development. But U.S. LNG costs $8 to $10 per million BTU to deliver to Asian markets, while Russian Arctic LNG costs $5 to $6 per million BTU. The cost advantage is structural, based on shorter shipping distances and lower production costs. Western LNG cannot outcompete Russian LNG on price. It can only compete when sanctions or politics remove Russian supply from consideration. The trap is that Russian LNG operates in the space between prohibitive to sanction and impossible to outcompete. The volumes are too large to ignore, the prices are too low to beat, and the infrastructure is too mobile to destroy. Every year that the system operates is a year that Asian dependency deepens and Western leverage weakens. Russia's strategic patience has converted pipeline vulnerability into LNG advantage. The explosion that was supposed to cripple Russian energy exports instead accelerated the transition to a system that cannot be crippled the same way. This is what a system looks like when the attack succeeded tactically but failed strategically. The informed are not waiting for official announcements to understand what's happening. LNG carrier charter rates for ice-class vessels have increased 340% since 2022, reflecting scarcity value for the specialized ships that can serve Arctic routes. The market is pricing in demand for Arctic LNG logistics that official projections don't yet capture. Russian LNG export volumes reached 37 million tons in 2025, up 23% from pre-war levels, despite sanctions explicitly designed to constrain growth. The volumes are measured. They are not estimates. the sanctions have not achieved their stated objective. Yamal LNG project equity values have been written down to zero on the books of Western partners who cannot realize their investments under sanctions. But the facilities continue operating, the revenues continue flowing, and the gas continues reaching customers. The write-downs reflect accounting conventions, not physical reality. Chinese LNG import infrastructure has added 45 million tons of annual receiving capacity since 2022, more than total Russian Arctic export capacity. The build-out is sized for supply sources that include Russian Arctic at volumes exceeding current production. The infrastructure investment commits China to a supply relationship that will persist for decades regardless of Western preferences. Physical gas prices in Asian markets have decoupled from European benchmarks, reflecting supply security that Asian buyers have secured while European buyers remain exposed. The Japan-Korea marker trades at sustained discounts to TTF, the European benchmark, for the first time since Asian LNG premium pricing became standard. Asia has gas. Europe competes for what remains. The spread between spot LNG prices and long-term contract prices has widened to record levels. Buyers who locked in Russian supply at contract prices are paying 35 to 40% less than buyers forced to purchase on spot markets. The contract holders include Chinese and Indian entities with Russian supply commitments that extend to 2050. The question is not whether Russian Arctic LNG has successfully bypassed pipeline vulnerabilities. The question is, who understands that bypass well enough to position for its consequences? A pipe on the Baltic seabed, cut by explosions, 55 billion cubic meters of annual capacity destroyed in a single night, and a replacement system that ships the same gas to different customers through routes that cannot be sabotaged because they exist only when tankers traverse them. This is not adaptation. This is transformation. The conversion of a pipeline supplier into a seaborne supplier, with all the strategic flexibility that mobile infrastructure provides. Physics doesn't negotiate, ships don't stay in one place, and reality, eventually, asserts itself over every strategy that assumed destroying the pipes would destroy the supply. The divergence between pipeline infrastructure and LNG infrastructure is now complete. What happens next is not prediction. It's 50 million tons per year of gas that flows through no fixed route, on ships that cannot be interdicted, to customers who have stopped asking permission.